The sun slowly and gently rose over the hills of Bozeman. Montana poured a warm, golden light over the valley, where the old Brooks Ranch stood, like a memory that wouldn't go away. The world was only partly awake. The breeze rustled the cottonwoods and the early birds quiet, murmur as they found their morning voices. Brooks stood on the back porch, with her bare feet on the cool, aged boards. She was 10 years old and made of stronger stuff than most adults. Life had asked too much of her, too young, but she had learnt to bear the burden in silence. She had been living with her grandfather since her parents died in a car accident 2 winters ago. Walter Brooks was in his late 60s and had been a firefighter for a long time. He didn't say much, and his sadness made him even quieter, but he loved Lena with a strong, wordless devotion that showed in the way he replaced fence posts and provided hot dinners for her when she got home from work. Lena took a sip of milk from a chipped enamel cup and looked over the fields like a guard. Mornings were hers alone, the only time of day that still felt free of loss. She could pretend that the world was still complete, since the light was just coming up and the sky was big and forgiving. She didn't know it yet, but everything she thought she understood about silence, strength, and loyalty was about to alter. The sound of weeds rustling behind the barn was the first sign. The grass grew taller in the back, where no mower had been in years. Lena pushed aside thick stalks and climbed over a fallen rail, squinting at the sun-dappled clearing near the back fence. That's when she saw him. At first, it looked like a shadow curled low and unmoving, part of the earth itself. But as her eyes got used to the light, Lena realized it was an animal, a big dog. Her heart skipped a beat. He was dirty, with dry mud and burrs stuck to his coat. Walter said, "You don't train a shepherd, you work with one." "Hey," Lena whispered. The dog didn't move, didn't growl, just looked at her with calm, deep amber eyes, not threatening, not afraid. She stepped closer slowly. A frayed rope was tied tight around his neck and looped too. The fence post half chewed, but still holding. She crouched low, reaching into her back pocket, where her grandpa's old pocket knife always lived. Now, with hands steadier than her heartbeat, she sliced through the rope. He didn't run, he simply blinked and waited. Lena didn't know what to expect when the rope slipped free from the post. Maybe the dog would bolt into the trees. Maybe he'd growl or limp away, fading back into whatever place he'd come from. But he didn't. He stayed still for a moment. Then, as Lena stepped back slowly, he lifted his head and stood wobbly but balanced. He took one step, then another, quiet, steady. He was following her. Lena led him across the tall grass, past the barn and the empty chicken coop, toward the house that hadn't seen a new soul in years. The dog's paws made no sound against the dry dirt path, like he'd learned long ago how to move without drawing attention. When she opened the back door, she hesitated just a second, but then stepped inside. He followed the screen creak behind them. The dog stood just past the threshold, scanning the room like it mattered. He didn't sniff, didn't whine. He just stood still, watching Lena. A voice called from the kitchen, "That you, Grandpa?" When Walter Brooks spotted the dog, he halted in his tracks and dried his hands on a dish towel. When the world he was tied up out back, Lena stated calmly, "He's hurt." Walter's eyes tightened. "And you carried him inside?" He didn't snarl or bark. He just followed me. The dog stared back at Walter without blinking. Walter didn't say anything, but as he looked closer, his face changed just a little bit. Walter Brooks had seen a lot in his life, such fires that were louder than thunder, people who were braver than they should have been, and dogs that barked more than they bit. He could tell when he spotted a German shepherd. Walter had never seen the dog sniff about, mark its territory, or even wag its tail. He stood still, looking back and forth between Lena and Walter, as if he were taking in the room and everyone in it. Walter walked slowly toward them and knelt down, his age showing. The dog didn't bark or move, but he did lean forward a little, as if he knew what was going on. "Can we keep him?" Lena said as she crouched down next to them. She asked in a calm, optimistic voice, but Walter didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, walked to the fridge, took out a cold piece of leftover bacon, and put it out in his open palm. The dog received it carefully. No snatch, no snap, simply a delicate lift and a quiet chew. "I'll think about it," Walter said, but Lena didn't say anything. Inside, something lit up. She had expected a no, maybe even a lecture, But Walter hadn't turned the dog away yet, and that was enough to make her smile. She needed a friend that night, so she dragged an old dog bed from the shed and set it beside her own. She cleaned him up with a damp cloth, careful not to pull at the mats, and gave him chicken broth in a chipped bowl. She watched as he drank slowly, never taking his eyes off her. She named him Shadow not because it meant something, but because it felt like a name he already knew. When she turned off the lamp, he curled up at the foot of her bed, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without waking up in the dark. Shadow sat at the back door, still standing, watching like a sentry waiting for orders. It was as if he had always been there, seamlessly becoming a part of their lives. Walter noticed it right away. That wasn't just instinct, it was discipline. He stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, watching the dog as if seeing him for the first time. German Shepherd, he muttered to himself, no doubt about it. Walter had worked with shepherds before, during his firefighting days and search and rescue drills, and even once during a flood response. They were smart, loyal, and most importantly, trained, and this one moved like he still remembered every lesson. Later that morning, while mending the north fence, Walter heard a metal creak that sounded familiar and almost dropped his pliers. Shadow pushed the latch on the gate with his nose, lifted it up, and walked through. He pushed the gate shut with a front paw. Walter blinked. That's not something a stray would know. Walter sat on the porch next to Shadow that night after Lena went to bed. The dog sat still and calm, even though the wood was creaking under his weight. For the first time in almost a year, Walter drove to Bozeman. The library seemed smaller than he recalled, but the young librarian helped him look through all the databases she could get to. Most of the results were empty, except for a forgotten corner of an old military handler. Adam Cole said the account was old and inactive, but that was enough for Walter to not say anything to Lena that night. He sat by the window and watched her pour broth into Shadow's dish. The dog stayed perfectly still until she nodded, and then he ate slowly and carefully. Walter could feel something moving deep in his chest. This dog had not only survived something he had done, but he was also still responding a call that no one else could hear. When Shadow came into her life, the air felt lighter, the mornings were warm, and the days weren't just chores, they were shared. She had never had a friend before, who listened like he did, who followed her through the tall grass, who lay beside her in the garden, while she doodled clouds in her notebook. He didn't need to say anything. He just stayed. So Saturday came with sunshine and the smell of fried food. Lena wore her old baseball cap and patch pants. Shadow walked next to her, without a leash, as still as a stone. There was a lot of barking, shouting commands, jingling collars, and people polishing their dogs, like trophies at the fairs. Lena and Shadow lingered on the edge. He didn't bark or pull, he just copied her. She smiled again and came over. Before Lena's family's dog training flyers were everywhere, Troy Ashford had spotted him. His Belgian Malinois, Dakota, was thin, had piercing eyes, and couldn't sit still. He saw Lena, but the dog that allowed the mud in the shade didn't do anything. Lena's smile went away, but her shoulders stayed the same. Jono moved like a whisper in the wind. He didn't bark or snarl. He merely stood in a low posture, with his eyes steadfast and ahead. There was one solid wall between the charging dog and the youngster. Lena, frozen at the edge of the ring, blinked fast, her hands still at her sides. When Shadow returned to her, tail calm, eyes alert, she knelt and placed both arms around his neck. She didn't need anyone to explain what had happened. She had brought her friend here to be seen, but now he had reminded everyone what it means to be known. The final round was scheduled for early Sunday morning, just as the mist was lifting from the fields, and the breeze carried the scent of hay and fresh soil. The crowd was quiet, seated on metal bleachers along the edge of the arena. Most had heard whispers about the mutt with the soldier's eyes, and even those who came for flashy breeds now sat a little straighter, waiting. Lena stood at the starting line, hand resting lightly on Shadow's back. No leash, no harness, just quiet trust. The judge lifted his clipboard. Handler ready? Lena nodded once. Begin. The first task was obedience. She pointed left, Shadow turned in a clean arc, and sat. She moved her shoulders slightly. He lay down. Not once did she speak. They moved together like choreography, learned not through training, but through being. Then came scent work. 3 wooden boxes were spaced out evenly. One held Lena's scent from a cloth she had handled that morning. Shadow slowly approached each box and sat next to the right one. The crowd murmured, and the judge wrote down what he saw. Finally, in the protection trial, a decoy in a padded suit charged at Lena with practiced aggression. Shadow didn't jump or bark. He didn't move until the man was within 5 feet. Then, with a sudden stillness, he stepped in front of her. There was no growl or contact, just presence. The man froze, and the judge stood up from his seat. Silence fell across the field. From that silence, a man stepped forward from the crowd. He wore a clean polo with the insignia of AK-9 military unit embroidered over the chest. His gray hair was cropped close, and his eyes were alert. A few spectators turned, and some recognized him as Master Sergeant Raymond Clark. "I know that dog," he remarked. Lena looked up, not sure what to think. Shadow didn't move, his eyes fixed on the man. Clark quietly strolled into the arena, crouched down in front of Shadow, clicked his tongue, and then calmly stepped forward. He caught K9B91's hair behind his right ear. "Bravo 91, he said under his breath. "I trained him myself. 5 years ago, he went to Afghanistan, and no one ever saw him again after the Canyon Op." We thought. He hadn't finished the sentence. The audience was still whispering. Troy Ashford pushed forward. "This is crazy. They're just making things up, with no proof." Then from behind the vet booth, near the north end of the arena, Dr. Forster stepped out. She had been treating pets all weekend, as part of the fair's animal wellness program. She held up a folder and said, "I examined him weeks ago. This is his scan record and government-issued microchip." Walter brought the vet report and a picture of the tattoo that had been taken in their kitchen weeks before. "This dog didn't just walk off the street," Walter said. And there was silence again. A fair organizer came back with a laptop. "We've looked over the footage from last night," she said, "and we do have camera angles on the competitor area." The night before, Troy had crept toward Lena's crate. He was immediately disqualified, and so was Mason Ashford for helping him. They took away all their awards, but Lena didn't say or grin. Instead, she crouched down next to Shadow and put her arms around his neck. "You never needed a title," she said softly. That night, as the sun set and the field turned golden, Lena and Shadow were asked to come back into the arena because they had done so well in all areas. For their quiet service, Bravo 91 and handler Lena Brooks were recognized grand champions. The throng stood like soldiers. For days after, the fences were still leaning, the barn still needed paint, and Walter still complained about the price of feed and the rooster that never crowed on time. But something had changed. Lena chuckled when Shadow rolled in the mulch in the garden and came out looking like a shrub that could walk. Walter saw that his ears twitched toward sounds no one else could hear, and that he stayed perfectly still when a car came up, as if he were waiting for someone who hadn't come yet. One evening, Walter sat next to him on the porch and looked out over the wide land. "Are you still looking?" Walter asked in a hushed voice. "I guess some missions don't end after the battle stops," because Shadow didn't move. That night, Lena found an old shoebox in the attic and filled it with drawings and sketches of Shadow in all his quiet glory. She also added a photocopy of his vet report, an article from the local paper, and a note she wrote in pencil that said, "You didn't get lost. You came." Those who saw the gentle link between a girl and her dog would always remember Bravo 91. They would remember the girl's quiet strength as she learned to trust again, and the soldier who never stopped serving.